The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance was an economic organization from 1949 to 1991 under the leadership of the Soviet Union that comprised the countries of the Eastern Bloc along with a number of communist states elsewhere in the world. The descriptive term was often applied to all multilateral activities involving members of the organization, rather than being restricted to the direct functions of Comecon and its organs. This usage was sometimes extended as well to bilateral relations among members, because in the system of socialist international economic relations, multilateral accords, typically of a general nature, tended to be implemented through a set of more detailed bilateral agreements. According to some historians, Moscow was concerned about the Marshall Plan. Comecon was meant to prevent countries in the Soviet sphere of influence from moving towards that of the Americans and Southeast Asia. Comecon was the Eastern Bloc's reply to the formation in Western Europe of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, a prelude to the European Economic Community and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Name in various languages. In Albanian, Kashila agreements.According reciprocal, KNER. In Bulgarian. In Czech, Rada Vjemne hospodarske pomoci RVHP. In Estonian, Vestatikus Majendusabinu Kogu VMN. In German, Ratvergegensätzlichwirtschaftshilfe RGW. In Hungarian, Kolksanos Gazdazagi Segagi Tanaksa KGSD. In Latvian, Savstarpjas Ekonomiskas Palazibase Padome SEP. In Lithuanian, Ekonomans Savitapio Pagalbos Taryba ESPT. In Polish, Rada Wojemnij Pomocy Gospodarcze RWPG. In Portuguese, Consolo para Assistência Económica Mutua CAEM. In Romanian, Consiliul de Ajută Economic Reciproc IA. In Russian. In Slovak, Rada Vjomnij Hospodarskij Pomoci RVHP. In Spanish, Consejo de Ayuda Mutua Económica CAEM. In Ukrainian. In Vietnamese, Hoi Dong Tuing Tr Kinte HTHTTKT. Membership. January 1949, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Soviet Union, February 1949, Albania 1950, East Germany 1962, Mongolia 1972, Cuba 1978, Vietnam. Observer status, 1956, North Korea, 1964, Yugoslavia, 1973, Finland, 1975, Iraq, Mexico, 1976, Angola, 1984, Nicaragua, 1985, Mozambique, 1986, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Laos, South Yemen. In the late 1950s, a number of communist-ruled non-member countries, the People's Republic of China, North Korea, Mongolia, Vietnam, and Yugoslavia, were invited to participate as observers in Comecon sessions. Although Mongolia and Vietnam later gained full membership, China stopped attending Comecon sessions after 1961. Yugoslavia negotiated a form of associate status in the organization, specified in its 1964 agreement with Comecon. Collectively, the members of the Comecon did not display the necessary prerequisites for economic integration. The level of industrialization was low and uneven, with a single dominant member producing 70% of the community national product. In the late 1980s there were 10 full members, the Soviet Union, 6 East European countries, and 3 extra-regional members. geography, therefore, no longer united Comecon members. Wide variations in economic size and level of economic development also tended to generate divergent interests among the member countries. All these factors combined to give rise to significant differences in the member states' expectations about the benefits to be derived from membership in Comecon. Unity was provided instead by political and ideological factors. All Comecon members were united by a commonality of fundamental class interests and the ideology of Marxism-Leninism, and had common approaches to economic ownership and management. In 1949, the ruling communist parties of the founding states were also linked internationally through the Common Form, from which Yugoslavia had been expelled the previous year. Although the Common Form was disbanded in 1956, inter-party links continued to be strong among Comecon members, and all participated in periodic international conferences of communist parties. Comecon provided a mechanism through which its leading member, the Soviet Union, sought to foster economic links with and among its closest political and military allies. The East European members of Comecon were also militarily allied with the Soviet Union in the Warsaw Pact. There were three kinds of relationships, besides the 10 full memberships, with the Comecon. Yugoslavia was the only country considered to have associate member status. On the basis of the 1964 agreement, Yugoslavia participated in 21 of the 32 key Comecon institutions as if it were a full member. Finland, Iraq, Mexico, and Nicaragua had a non-socialist cooperant status with Comecon, because the governments of these countries were not empowered to conclude agreements in the name of private companies. The governments did not take part in Comecon operations. They were represented in Comecon by commissions made up of members of the government and the business community. The commissions were empowered to sign various framework agreements with Comecon's Joint Commission on Cooperation. After 1957, Comecon allowed certain countries with communist or pro-Soviet governments to attend sessions as observers. In November 1986, delegations from Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Laos, Nicaragua, and the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen attended the 42nd Council session as observers. History. Foundation. The Comecon was founded in 1949 by the Soviet Union, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. The primary factors in Comecon's formation appear to have been Joseph Stalin's desire to cooperate and strengthen the international socialist relationship at an economic level with the lesser states of Central Europe, and which were now increasingly cut off from the traditional markets and suppliers in the rest of Europe. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland had remained interested in martial aid despite the requirements for a convertible currency and market economies. These requirements, which would inevitably have resulted in stronger economic ties to free European markets than to the Soviet Union, were absolutely unacceptable to Stalin, who in July 1947 ordered these communist-dominated governments to pull out of the Paris Conference on the European Recovery Program. This has been described as the moment of truth in the post-World War II division of Europe. According to the Soviet view, the Anglo-American bloc and American monopolists, whose interests had nothing in common with those of the European people, had spurned East-West collaboration within the framework agreed within the United Nations, that is, through the Economic Commission for Europe. However, as always, Stalin's precise motives are inscrutable. They may well have been more negative than positive, with Stalin more anxious to keep other powers out of neighboring buffer states than to integrate them. Furthermore, GATT's notion of non-discriminatory treatment of trade partners was incompatible with notions of socialist solidarity. In any event, Proposals for a customs union and economic integration of Central and Eastern Europe date back at least to the revolutions of 1848, and the state-to-state trading inherent in centrally planned economies required some sort of coordination. Otherwise, a monopolist seller would face a monopolist buyer, with no structure to set prices. Comecon was established at a Moscow Economic Conference January 5–January 8, 1949, at which the 6 founding member countries were represented. Its foundation was publicly announced on January 25. Albania joined a month later, and East Germany in 1950. Recent research by the Romanian researcher Elena Dragomir suggests that Romania played a rather important role in the Comecon's creation in 1949. Dragomir argues that Romania was interested in the creation of a system of cooperation to improve its trade relations with the other peoples' democracies, especially with those able to export industrial equipment and machinery to Romania. According to Dragomir, in December 1948, the Romanian leader Gheorghe Dej sent a letter to Stalin, proposing the creation of the Comecon. At first, planning seemed to be moving along rapidly. After pushing aside Nikolai Vazhninsky's technocratic, price-based approach, the direction appeared to be toward a coordination of national economic plans, but with no coercive authority from Comecon itself. All decisions would require unanimous ratification, and even then governments would separately translate these into policy. Then in summer 1950, probably unhappy with the favorable implications for the effective individual and collective sovereignty of the smaller states, Stalin seems to have taken personnel by surprise, bringing operations to a nearly complete halt. As the Soviet Union moved domestically toward autarky and internationally toward an embassy system of meddling in other countries' affairs, directly rather than by constitutional means, Comecon's scope was officially limited in November 1950 to practical questions of facilitating trade. One important legacy of this brief period of activity was the Sofia Principle, adopted at the August 1949 Comecon Council session in Bulgaria. This radically weakened intellectual property rights, making each country's technologies available to the others for a nominal charge that did little more than cover the cost of documentation. This naturally benefited the less industrialized Comecon countries, and especially the technologically lagging Soviet Union, at the expense of East Germany and Czechoslovakia and, to a lesser extent, Hungary and Poland. Khrushchev era. After Stalin's death in 1953, Comecon again began to find its footing. In the early 1950s, all Comecon countries had adopted relatively autarkic policies. Now they began again to discuss developing complementary specialties, and in 1956, 10 permanent standing committees arose, intended to facilitate coordination in these matters. The Soviet Union began to trade oil for Comecon manufactured goods. There was much discussion of coordinating 5-year plans. However, once again, trouble arose. The Polish protests and Hungarian uprising led to major social and economic changes, including the 1957 abandonment of the 1956–60 Soviet 5-year plan. As the Comecon governments struggled to re-establish the legitimacy and popular support, the next few years saw a series of small steps toward increased trade and economic integration, including the introduction of the transferable ruble, revised efforts at national specialization, and a 1959 charter modeled after the 1957 Treaty of Rome. Once again, however, efforts at transnational central planning fail. In December 1961, a council session approved the basic principles of the International Socialist Division of Labor, which talked of closer coordination of plans and of concentrating production of similar products in one or several socialist countries. Quote, in November 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev followed this up with a call for a common single planning organ. Quote, this was resisted by Czechoslovakia, Hungary and Poland, but most emphatically by increasingly nationalistic Romania, which strongly rejected the notion that they should specialize in agriculture. In Central and Eastern Europe, only Bulgaria happily took on an assigned role. Essentially, by the time the Soviet Union was calling for tight economic integration, they no longer had the power to impose it. Despite some slow headway, integration increased in petroleum, electricity, and other technical, scientific sectors, and the 1963 founding of an International Bank for Economic Cooperation. Comecon countries all increased trade with the West relatively more than with one another. Brezhnev era. From its founding until 1967, Comecon had operated only on the basis of unanimous agreements. It had become increasingly obvious that the result was usually failure. In 1967, Comecon adopted the interested party principle, under which any country could opt out of any project they chose, still allowing the other member states to use Comecon mechanisms to coordinate their activities. In principle, a country could still veto, but the hope was that they would typically choose just to step aside rather than either veto or be a reluctant participant. This aimed, at least in part, at allowing Romania to chart its own economic course without leaving Comecon entirely or bringing it to an impasse. Also, until the late 1960s, the official term for Comecon activities was cooperation. The term integration was always avoided because of its connotations of monopolistic capitalist collusion. However, after the Special Council session of April 1969 and the development and adoption of the Comprehensive Program for the further extension and improvement of cooperation and the further development of socialist economic integration by Comecon member countries, Comecon activities were officially termed integration, although such equalization had not been a pivotal point in the formation and implementation of Comecon's economic policies. Improved economic integration had always been Comecon's goal, while such integration was to remain a goal, and while Bulgaria became yet more tightly integrated with the Soviet Union. Progress in this direction was otherwise continually frustrated by the national central planning prevalent in all Comecon countries, by the increasing diversity of its members and by the overwhelming asymmetry and resulting distrust between the many small member states and the Soviet superstate, which, in 1983, accounted for 88% of Comecon's territory and 60% of its population. In this period, there were some efforts to move away from central planning, by establishing intermediate industrial associations and combines in various countries. However, these groupings typically proved unwieldy, conservative, risk-averse, and bureaucratic, reproducing the problems they had been intended to solve. One economic success of the 1970s was the development of Soviet oil fields. While doubtless East Europeans resented having to defray some of the costs of developing the economy of the hated overlord and oppressor, they benefited from low prices for fuel and other mineral products. As a result, Comecon economies generally showed strong growth in the mid-1970s. They were largely unaffected by the 1973 oil crisis. Another short-term economic gain in this period was that détente brought opportunities for investment and technology transfers from the West. This also led to an importation of Western cultural attitudes, especially in Central Europe. However, many undertakings based on Western technology were less than successful. Other investment was wasted on luxuries for the party elite, and most Comecon countries ended up indebted to the West when capital flows died out as détente faded in the late 1970s, and from 1979 to 1983, all of Comecon experienced a recession from which they never recovered in the communist era. Romania and Poland experienced major declines in the standard of living. Perestroika, the 1985 Comprehensive Program for Scientific and Technical Progress and the rise to power of Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev increased Soviet influence in Comecon operations and led to attempts to give Comecon some degree of supranational authority. The Comprehensive Program for Scientific and Technical Progress was designed to improve economic cooperation through the development of a more efficient and interconnected scientific and technical base. This was the era of perestroika, the last attempt to put the Comecon economies on a sound economic footing. Gorbachev and his economic mentor Abel Aganbegyan hoped to make revolutionary changes in the economy, foreseeing that science will increasingly become a direct productive force. As Marx foresaw, by the year 2000, the renewal of plant and machinery will be running at 6% or more per year. The program was not a success. The Gorbachev regime made too many commitments on too many fronts, thereby overstretching and overheating the Soviet economy. Bottlenecks and shortages were not relieved but exacerbated, while the East European members of Comecon resented being asked to contribute scarce capital to projects that were chiefly of interest to the Soviet Union. Furthermore, the liberalization that by June 25, 1988 allowed Comecon countries to negotiate trade treaties directly with the European Community, and the Sinatra Doctrine, under which the Soviet Union allowed that change would be the exclusive affair of each individual country, marked the beginning of the end for Comecon. Although the revolutions of 1989 did not formally end Comecon, and the Soviet government itself lasted until 1991, the March 1990 meeting in Prague was little more than a formality, discussing the coordination of non-existent five-year plans. From January 1, 1991, the countries shifted their dealings with one another to a hard currency market basis. The result was a radical decrease in trade with one another, as Eastern Europe exchanged asymmetrical trade dependence on the Soviet Union for an equally asymmetrical commercial dependence on the European Community. The final Comecon Council session took place June 28, 1991 in Budapest, and led to an agreement to disband within 90 days. The Soviet Union itself was dismantled on December 26, 1991. After the fall of the Soviet Union and communist rule in Eastern Europe, East Germany automatically joined the European Union in 1990. The Baltic states, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia joined the EU in 2004, followed by Bulgaria and Romania in 2007 and recently, Croatia in 2013. Exchange. Working with neither meaningful exchange rates nor a market economy, Comecon countries had to look to world markets as a reference point for prices. But unlike agents acting in a market, prices tended to be stable over a period of years, rather than constantly fluctuating, which assisted central planning. Also, there was a tendency to underprice raw materials relative to the manufactured goods produced in many of the Comecon countries. International barter helped preserve the Comecon countries' scarce hard currency reserves. In strict economic terms, barter inevitably harmed countries whose goods would have brought higher prices in the free market, whose imports could have been obtained more cheaply, and benefited those for whom it was the other way around. Still, all of the Comecon countries gained some stability, and the governments gained some legitimacy, and in many ways this stability and protection from the world market was viewed, at least in the early years of Comecon, as an advantage of the system, as was the formation of stronger ties with other communist countries. Within Comecon, there were occasional struggles over just how this system should work. Early on, Nikolai Vazhninsky pushed for a more law-governed and technocratic price-based approach. However, with the August 1948 death of Andrei Zhdanov, Vazhninsky lost his patron and was soon accused of treason as part of the Leningrad affair. Within 2 years he was dead in prison. Instead, what won out was a physical planning approach that strengthened the role of central governments over technocrats. At the same time, the effort to create a single regime of planning, common economic organization, with the ability to set plans throughout the Comecon region also came to naught. A protocol to create such a system was signed January 18, 1949, but never ratified. While historians are not unanimous on why this was stymied, it clearly threatened the sovereignty not only of the smaller states, but even of the Soviet Union itself. Since an international body would have had real power, Stalin clearly preferred informal means of intervention in the other Comecon states. This lack of either rationality or international central planning tended to promote autarky in each Comecon country, because none fully trusted the others to deliver goods and services. With few exceptions, foreign trade in the Comecon countries was a state monopoly, and the state agencies and captive trading companies were often corrupt. Even at best, this tended to put several removes between a producer and any foreign customer, limiting the ability to learn to adjust to foreign customers' needs. Furthermore, there was often strong political pressure to keep the best products for domestic use in each country. From the early 1950s to Comecon's demise in the early 1990s, intra-Comecon trade, except for Soviet petroleum, was in steady decline. Oil transfers, beginning no later than the early 1970s, Soviet petroleum and natural gas were routinely transferred within Comecon at below market rates. Most Western commentators have viewed this as implicit, politically motivated subsidization of shaky economies to diffuse discontents and reward compliance with Soviet wishes. However, other commentators say that this may not have been deliberate policy, noting that whenever prices differ from world market prices, there will be winners and losers. They argue that this may have been simply an unforeseen consequence of two factors: the slow adjustment of Comecon prices during a time of rising oil and gas prices, and the fact that mineral resources were abundant in the Comecon sphere relative to manufactured goods. A possible point of comparison is that there were also winners and losers under EEC agricultural policy in the same period. Ineffective production. The organization of Comecon was officially focused on common expansion of states, more effective production and building relationships between countries within, and as in every planned economy, operations did not reflect state of market, innovations, availability of items of the specific needs of a country. One example came from former Czechoslovakia. In the 1970s, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia finally realized that there was a need for underground trains. Czechoslovak designers projected a cheap but technologically innovative underground train. The train was a state-of-the-art project, capable of moving underground or on the surface using standard rails, had a high number of passenger seats, and was lightweight. According to the designers, the train was technologically more advanced than the trains used in New York's subway, London's tube, or the Paris metro. However, due to the plan of Comecon, older Soviet trains were used, which guaranteed profit for the Soviet Union and work for workers in Soviet factories. That economical change led to the cancellation of the R1 trains by Honzik. The Comecon plan, though more profitable for the Soviets, if less resourceful for the Czechs and Slovaks, forced the Czechoslovak government to buy trains, ECs, and 81-71, both of which were designed in early 1950s and were heavy, unreliable and expensive. On the other hand, Czechoslovak trams and jet trainers were the standard for all Comecon countries, including the USSR, and other countries could develop their own designs but only for their own needs, like Poland. Poland was a manufacturer of light helicopters for Comecon countries. The USSR developed their own model Kamov Kar-26 and Romania produced French helicopters under license for their own market. In a formal or informal way, often the countries were discouraged from developing their own designs that competed with the main Comecon design.